I call the honourable member Shane Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. A very wise call. Can I congratulate you, Mr Speaker, also on your reappointment to the job. This is my first opportunity to do so. And can I say, in my time in this place, I think it would be fair to say there's never been a more qualified team, that is all of the speakers that occupy the role you do, in regard to knowledge of standing orders and process in the House. So I'm sure you'll maintain the standards that we've become accustomed to from you, so congratulations on that. It's always a privilege to follow my fellow CPA co-chair in one of these debates, address and reply debates. She touched on a range of child poverty social issues. I was once asked, Mr Speaker, what I would consider it to be if I was considered as rich. And my answer to that and to her is, providing I can have 3 reasonably nutritious feeds a day, have a dry bed to sleep in, be able to pay the phone and power bill and the rent, and have a car that will pass the warrant of fitness every 6 months, I'd consider myself to be rich. But of course, if you look at our colleagues on the other side of the House by comparison, that's not what they consider, because those that I spoke of, which are basic needs, they see that as minimum or poverty. Actually, if you don't have Sky TV now, something needs to be done about it, and social welfare should trump up. Let's have a look at the comparison under the national government led by John Key. We, in the last term of Parliament, faced more crises, I think you could say, than any government in modern history, when you look at everything that went wrong during that period. But the one that is, I guess, the most understated and certainly completely ignored by the opposition is the fact that we've gone through what has been termed by international commentators as the biggest economic meltdown or depression since the 1930s. And I think we should reflect on that, because back at home, sure, there have been some people and some companies and some individuals that have suffered during these economic times, but overwhelmingly we are in a better position economically than most of our trading or competing nation colleagues. And when you ask the question why that is, then there is only one conclusion, and that is because of the solid, sensible, considered economic policies of the Key government. The Key government intends to have New Zealand back in surplus by 2014. No mean feat. In fact, some would say an unrealistic goal. But all of the forecasts at this stage suggest that that is possible. And I just want to touch on something that I think has been the number one driver in that, and that is the outstanding achievements within our agricultural industries. It's often overlooked, I have to say, by economic commentators, political commentators, and our opposition, just what a role the agricultural sector plays in the New Zealand economy. What has happened in the agricultural sector? Well, at a time when markets have shrunk, when discretionary spending has shrunk, when we have faced some of the toughest economic circumstances internationally, our market exports have continued to grow, particularly in the dairy industry. And I want to congratulate the work that the Honourable Tim Grosser and others have done in making that possible, and opening up markets where markets didn't exist, with doing trade deals with countries we have historically had difficulty trading with. And when you look at that, Mr Speaker, the Key-led government has achieved more in the previous 3 years and has a program going forward to achieve more than anything we've seen before. New Zealand has always been a proud exporter of agricultural products, and I've heard comment recently, and quite recently actually from the new Labour leader, about how we need to spread our horizons and expand into non-commodity trading. Couldn't agree more. I think the Leader of the Opposition absolutely has nailed it with that comment. We must do that. But what that doesn't mention is the fact that about 60% of what Fonterra exported last year didn't exist 5 years ago. And to suggest that those that are suffering from asthma and use inhalers, and that inhaling product, if you like, or carrier for those inhalers, is a lactose-based product developed in the New Zealand dairy industry, to suggest that that is a bulk commodity is simplistic in its extreme and childish. And we need to look at where our opportunities exist. If you go through the basket of products that we export from that industry, you'll find, Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, that we have nutraceuticals, pharmaceuticals, high-tech protein-based capsules for pharmaceuticals. The list goes on. As I said, 60% of what was exported from our biggest company didn't exist 5 years ago, and I challenge the opposition to go and have a look at some of that stuff. So what are the big issues facing the government going forward, and what does this new national government need to address in partnership with its support parties? Well, the first thing that we need to address is responsibly managing the government's finances. And if you look at the growth in the public sector through the whole 9 years of the previous government, and look at how sustainable that is in the current economic environment, and what the national government has done to achieve a higher level of service from our public sector with the same level of finance, then you'd have to conclude, Mr. Speaker, as would the rest of New Zealand, that that has been managed reasonably well. Building a more competitive and productive economy. Well, that doesn't mean, Mr. Speaker, throwing up a whole lot of cost of compliance, regulation, whether it be under the guise of environmental protection, whether it be under the guise of fairness and equality in terms of who pays what tax where, in terms of depreciation. I mean, wherever you look, the rhetoric that came out of the opposition in the last term of Parliament and prior to that was to place more costs. In fact, in the last term of Parliament, it was suggested that dairy farmers in New Zealand don't pay enough tax, and something should be done about that. Well, I have some dairy farming colleagues this year that are not that happy, that they are paying, 6 and 7 figures in some cases in tax. And I challenge others in the House or in the economy to step forward and demonstrate how they believe them paying a higher tax burden than they are already would be beneficial for New Zealand. I heard the previous speaker say that giving tax cuts to the rich is not the way forward in a struggling environment. Couldn't agree more if that's in fact what happened. But it's actually middle-class New Zealand that benefited the most from the last government's tax cuts. And I'd have to suggest to you that there are a large cross-section of New Zealanders now that do not pay that amount, that do not pay any tax at all if they have a family, so with the tax rebates that they get. Delivering and rebuilding on the Christchurch circumstance that we find ourselves in, something that no government would ever want or could plan for. A number one priority, Mr. Speaker, for this government. Huge amounts of capital committed to that. I don't think there's a single person in the Parliament that would get up and claim that we shouldn't be doing that. It's a question of how quickly we can do it, how we fund it, and how New Zealand can benefit from that. And going forward, once that has happened, how we can sustain the economy in the area. And so introducing irrigation to the Canterbury Plains, Mr. Speaker, and across the rest of New Zealand, where that is possible, where it is feasible, where it will give an economic return, is one of the key platforms that the key-led government have announced as a policy going forward. Mr. Speaker, this will be hugely beneficial to the New Zealand economy, and it doesn't mean 100% conversion of the Canterbury Plains to dairy. What it could mean is that we will diversify the land use there into a range of other developments. In fact, right at the moment, lamb fattening would return a higher return on investment than conversion to dairy, and markets internationally are opening up for that as well, along with everything else. So, Mr. Speaker, the key-led government has a dynamic plan going forward, has shown strong leadership to this point, and will manage the New Zealand economy, I think, better than any other group or combination in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member David Bennett.